Hello, my name is Angela Guerrero. I first like to acknowledge the Ugambe and Komoberi peoples as the traditional owners of these lands, and also the Jagera and Turrbal people as the traditional owners of the lands where I work from, and extend those acknowledgements to any traditional owners who might be present here. So this project aims to better understand the influence of social networks on adoption of land management practices for improving water quality in the Great Barrier Reef region. And this is because water quality continues to have detrimental impacts on Great Barrier Reef ecosystems, as we all know. And while sugarcane represents a very small proportion of land use in the GBR, it has a significant impact on inorganic nitrogen loads. So our study focuses on sugarcane. And the most recent scientific consensus statement states that achieving pollutant reduction targets will require significant scaling up of adoption practices, and it's recognized that one of the factors influencing such adoption is landholder relationships. So our research question is then, how do social relationships influence adoption? With the purpose of informing, hopefully, engagement strategies for scaling up adoption in the region. And two of our objectives were first to identify and characterize growers' social networks, and second, examine how different types of relationships play a role on the adoption of practices. And for that, we use a tool called NetMaps. In interviews with sugarcane growers, we mapped communication networks, used it to identify interaction types and characterize relationships, and also explore the process of practice adoption. Our case study region, sorry, this has a few clicks. Our case study region is the Mulgrave-Russell region in the wet tropics. This is an NRM region with the most amount of dissolving organic nitrogen load per year. And it's a region with about 80 farmers, of which we interviewed about 35 of them, which make up around 44% of that population. And we asked about different practices as well that they apply that are believed to reduce impact of inorganic nitrogen runoff on the left. And of course, these adoption rates are quite high. And it's important to clarify, first of all, that these are self-reported, but also that this survey came at the back of several initiatives in the region for improving water quality, especially with the last one there, nutrient management plans. So there was a program providing soil testing and then a plan out of that for nitrogen loads, or a nitrogen plan from that soil testing for free. And these rates could suggest that the program has had quite positive effects, but going forward, will be interesting to see whether these levels are kept. But the important point here, relevant for this study, is that this is the context in which we investigated the role of social networks, so high adoption rates. From the NetMaps, we were able to quantify the size of the farmers' social networks. The average number of people to whom a farmer talks to about farming practices is around 12, but of course that varies considerably from farmer to farmer. And these are the different networks in our sample, and of course they're very diverse. Some of them, I don't think you can see it there with the light, but some of them are really connected, others are quite less connected. Some, the black nodes are the participants we interviewed, and some of them, you can see how they connect to many different groups of people, and they might actually be playing a bridging role between those groups. So there's a lot we can do with this data, but here I'm just only going to talk about a little bit of it. So first of all, who is in these networks? Perhaps not surprising, well, it's a bit cut, but I can tell you. So other farmers, extension officers, and relatives make up the majority of these farmers' networks. But actually, farmers use their networks differently depending on the practice. So once we had mapped their network of who they talk to about farming practices, we also asked them who they talk to for, in particular, about fertilizer application. And this changed the picture a bit, with extension officers becoming more prominent in their networks, and also suppliers, and then farmers becoming less prominent, and families staying about the same for fertilizer, communication about fertilizer use. And these differences might have implications for engagement strategies for scaling up adoption in terms of the practice that we're considering to influence. However, exposure is not the same as influence. Exposure doesn't guarantee adoption. It can create awareness, but influence is needed to change behavior. And we actually think that influence in this particular context follows a complex contagion pattern. It's a complex term, but I'll explain it. So many things are spread through simple contagion in a network where one single exposure is enough for us to adopt that. But there are certain sources of resistance to simple contagions that makes them instead complex. And therefore, to understand what's going on in this system, we adopted theories of complex contagion. I'll briefly talk about that. So when complex contagion is at play, at least one of 4 barriers to adoption are present. One of them is credibility, and this is the idea that adopters act as sources of social proof for innovation. So when this social proof is needed, and in the context of adoption of farming practice, this could relate to making sure, for example, the practice is effective, you're facing a complex contagion situation. And according to the theory, the answer to overcome some of these barriers is social reinforcement, or exposure to multiple adopters, especially through strong ties, rather than ties to central or popular actors, which is what some extension programs try to do, and it could work in some instances, but when there's complex adoption of practice, you actually need the strong ties. And this is the idea that we kind of center on for the next few slides. So using net maps, we ask participants to detail their relationships with individuals in their network. This allows us to characterize these relationships, revealing that a significant proportion of the network ties in our sample are actually strong ties. This includes friendship, family ties, or trust relationships, which are stronger than your casual or transactional connections. It is important to note that one-time RB characterizes both friendship and trust, or family and trust. So we also looked at who's involved in these trust relationships. And as expected, we see relatives and other farmers, but also see representation of agricultural extension officers, and in some cases to suppliers as well. So this suggests that barriers to adoption, such as credibility, are being overcome in part through strong ties in this system, some of which might already be there, for example, friendships that I've had for many years or family, but certain others might be developed over time and maybe through some of the programs or initiatives in the region. And this is just a visual of what I showed you before, but the blue is either family, friendships, or trust relationships, which is quite prevalent, as you can see. So we also did some qualitative analysis, or are in the middle of doing that, to try to triangulate this finding of strong ties facilitating adoption. We looked into how friendship relationships are used in the process of adoption. So on the left are the type of interactions farmers have with whom they consider a friend, and the quotes exemplify this. So for example, how they share knowledge with others they consider friends, or also obtain advice from them. And the last one there is interesting because it showcases that the idea of need for social reinforcement, where the participant says that a friend has told him not to over-fertilize, but he then talks about doing trials anyway with other people to kind of test that, and he kind of laughs at the end saying, well, it's useless, but I kind of felt that I needed to do that anyway. While we couldn't do statistical analysis due to the small sample size, we did some correlations between our practices and the percentage of farmers in the participants' network. And we see some moderate positive relationships there between those two things. Of course, we cannot claim causality in any way, but this effect is certainly possible, and the qualitative data supports this, that a greater proportion of farmers in my network is kind of related to that adoption. 30 seconds, my God. And then that doesn't really translate when we looked at family. So we saw the contrary, that there's a negative correlation between proportion of family in my network and adoption. And I guess many things could be at play, but certainly our qualitative data suggests that family ties might be a barrier to adoption in this particular context, and we certainly want to do more research there, and that's where we focus next. The last thing was about trust, and again, trust, proportion of trust relationships and adoption, and again, we do see positive relationships there, which is good, and some take-home messages for you, which is summarizes what I've discussed, but I think I have to leave it there. Thank you very much.